The room was far too quiet for what it was designed to contain. Congressional Oversight Hearing Chamber always hummed with ambition, the paper shuffle of aides pretending not to panic, the low murmurs of lawyers practicing their poker faces, the mechanical movements of cameras mounted like gargoyles on the walls. But today, there was an unusual stillness, not absence of sound, but a kind of premonition. The silence before SHUNDERCLAP. Jasmine Crockett sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her posture precise, almost still, like a blade waiting in its sheath. The polished surface in front of her held neat stacks of annotated reports, highlighters capped, a legal pad bearing her looping handwriting. No wasted space. No wasted energy. She wore midnight blue, commanding, understated, with a silver lapel pin in the shape of Texas. Her presence was new to the chamber, but she carried herself like someone who had always known power was an illusion unless you made people afraid to ignore you. Across the room, Matt Gaetz lounged with casual entitlement, as though the seat belonged to him more than any district. He wore a smirk shaped like privilege and had the restless body language of a man used to commanding cameras, not earning them. His gaze flicked toward Jasmine once, twice, lingering the second time just long enough to register as deliberate. Fresh? Meat, one of his aides had whispered before the hearing. She's not ready. But that assumption was already beginning to unravel. Jasmine didn't look at him, not once, but she felt the stare. She'd felt that same gaze 100 times. Before, in law school hallways and courtrooms, in rooms full of men who thought pedigree was power and blackness was an interruption. She knew better now. Her silence wasn't submission. It was choice. The gavel would fall soon. Witnesses had been prepped. Statements rehearsed. Every angle calculated. But no one, not even Jasmine, knew that today would ignite something bigger than policy. No one knew this room, with its draped flags and muted decorum, was about to become a battlefield. And no one knew that the battle wouldn't begin with a law, but with a sentence that would burn its way through. Institutions. One that hadn't been spoken yet, but already hovered in the air. Waiting. The hearing had begun the way so many do, with polished introductions and hollow declarations of purpose. Beneath the banner hung above the dais, bold serif letters spelling out institutional integrity and public trust. Witnesses shuffled through opening statements, repeating soundbites that had been polished within an inch of meaning. The room, half watching and half performative, nodded along. C-SPAN cameras panned slowly. Committee members took turns feigning engagement, some tapping at tablets beneath the table, others scanning the witness list for partisan advantage. Jasmine sat upright, her pen tapping once against her notepad. The rhythm helped her stay alert through the procedural lull. She was biding her time. Matt Gaetz, by contrast, was theatrical boredom personified. His tie had loosened slightly since the hearing began, and he toyed with a paperclip in one hand while the witness, a former DOJ ethics officer, tried to explain the scope of misconduct reviews. "Thank you for your insight," Jasmine said calmly when her turn came, her voice measured but firm. "I'd like to return to your earlier point about procedural enforcement of accountability. She spoke clearly, surgically, working through her questions like a trial attorney cross-examining a star witness. She wasn't grandstanding, and that was part of the threat. She was competent, unflinching. Worse yet, she was being watched. And Matt Gaetz could feel it. He leaned forward, interrupting before the witness could reply. "Frankly, Miss Crockett," he said, his voice sharp with disdain, "you don't belong here." The chamber stilled. Jasmine's mouth closed mid-sentence. A beat passed, long enough to register discomfort, but short enough to be plausibly deniable. The room had not yet caught up with what had just been said, but the cameras had one blink. That's all Jasmine gave. A slow, deliberate blink, as if trying to decide whether the moment was real or hallucinated. Her pen stilled, her posture remained unchanged. But her silence now had a different charge. Gaetz leaned back again, almost smirking. He knew exactly what he had done. He'd spoken not just to her, but to a broader audience, to the base who wanted her silenced, to the pundits waiting to pounce. It wasn't just an insult. It was a dare. The Twitter feed started before the witness could resume. Live streams were clipped and reposted. Hashtags formed like storm clouds. Hashtag she belongs, hashtag Gaetz attack, hash Crockett clapback. No one had even heard her respond yet, but America was already watching. Waiting. And Jasmine Crockett had not yet begun to speak. The words wouldn't stop echoing, not in her mind, not on the news. Not in the world, you don't belong here. Cable news had seized on the moment like wolves to blood. Within an hour, clips were running side by side. Jasmine Crockett's stunned pause replayed in slow motion. Matt Gaetz's words underscored by talking heads debating intent, tone, precedent. Was it racism? Was it politics? Was it just Gaetz being Gaetz? On MSNBC, an anchor called it a chilling moment of coded gatekeeping. On Fox, the headline read, Crockett crumbles under pressure. Twitter had no such ambiguity. Hashtag she belongs was trending #1 worldwide. So was hashtag Gaetzgate, followed closely by hashtag Black Women in Power and hashtag Crockett clap back, despite the fact that Jasmine hadn't yet clapped back at all. Her phone buzzed again, a text from her mother this time. Hold your head, baby. We've seen worse, but this ain't staying quiet. Jasmine sat in the darkened corner of her office, fingers folded beneath her chin, staring at the silent phone like it might speak first. Her staff filtered around her, moving with the tense, too careful energy of people who know a storm is coming but don't yet know its shape. I think we need a statement. Her chief of staff, Lena, said gently. Not just a tweet, a press conference? Or at least a firm post. Everyone's waiting. Jasmine didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on her own reflection in the glass of the office window. Her face was tired, but still, the image flickered. Between her present self and all the younger versions that led here, she saw the girl in 3rd grade, hand raised, told by a teacher to let the others answer first. She saw herself in a courtroom in Dallas, being told by a senior partner that her tone might intimidate jurors. She saw law school debates where her ideas were praised only when echoed by someone else, someone white, someone male, and she remembered what she had promised herself after each of those cuts, that the next time someone tried to erase her, she would make sure the world remembered her instead. She turned from the window. I'm not issuing a statement, she said. Lena blinked. You're not? Jasmine stood slowly, voice steady. I'm going back into that hearing tomorrow, she said. And I'm going to answer him in the same room he tried to silence me in. Her voice sharpened, but this time I won't be the one pausing. The next morning, the hearing room wasn't just full, it was electric. Reporters who had ignored the early sessions now jostled for space. C-SPAN had shifted to continuous live coverage. Every seat on the dais was filled, and even the junior staffers had that jittery look of people who knew they might witness a moment that would be replayed for decades. Jasmine Crockett entered wearing stark, blinding white, not ivory, not cream, white, sharp, unmistakable, historical. It wasn't just fashion, it was statement. Echoing the suffragettes, echoing resistance, echoing every woman who had been told to stay in her place. It was deliberate. It was armor. Matt Gaetz saw her from across the chamber, his expression unreadable for a second too long. Then came the smirk, reflexive, performative, but his eyes flickered down. Not at her. At the phones already raised around the room, he knew she came prepared. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was how precise she would be. The chair gavelled the session open. Witnesses resumed. Statements continued. Gaetz launched into a monologue veiled as a question about ethics enforcement, his voice growing more pointed with every sentence. And while we discuss accountability, he drawled, perhaps we should consider whether this committee has prioritized theatrics over qualifications. Jasmine didn't wait for the end. Double quotes, Mr. Gaetz, she said, calmly, firmly, the interruption itself was a ripple through the room. He paused, half pleased. Yes, Congresswoman. She looked directly at him. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. The irony, she said, is that you need me to not belong here. Because if I do, then this institution must answer for itself. Silence. A thick, undodgeable silence. She continued, eyes locked to his, unflinching. "My presence doesn't threaten democracy, your comfort does." The entire chamber went breathless. The chair fumbled for the gavel, pounding once, twice. A nervous, useless gesture at control. "Order," the chair warned. "We will maintain decorum," but the spell had already broken. Gaetz leaned back slowly. The smirk was still there, but his jaw had tightened, and one hand twitched against the desk. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Outside, the internet exploded. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Her voice, trending globally. "Your comfort does," echoing across headlines, protest signs, college campuses. Late-night monologues. Jasmine had answered, not with rage, not with apology, but with truth, and the country, at last, had heard her. The halls of Capitol Hill were suddenly a maze of whispers. In back offices and sealed rooms, party leaders huddled, not to govern, but to contain. Behind a closed mahogany door on the third floor of the Rayburn building, Matt Gaetz leaned back in his chair as a senior Republican aide paced before him, voice tight with urgency. "You need to de-escalate this," the aide said. "Even the donors are getting nervous. They're calling it optics, but you and I both know this is a wildfire." Gaetz gave a dismissive chuckle, tossing a pen across the table. "This is theater," he said flatly, "and I'm the headliner. They want fireworks? I gave them an inferno? You gave them a viral quote that's now a campaign slogan for the other side," the aide snapped. "You think you're winning, but she's the one speaking at Harvard next week." Gaetz's jaw tightened. His ego refused to bend, but the cracks were showing. The smirk he wore in public didn't follow him here. Elsewhere in the Capitol, Jasmine sat in a quieter storm. Her staff had just cleared the room after a long strategy session. Lena lingered at the doorway, concern painting her features. "They're saying you should move on," she said. "Centrist Dems, a few legacy members, saying it's not constructive to escalate, that it distracts from legislative goals." Jasmine didn't answer right away. Her phone buzzed. Another interview request. She ignored it. Instead, her eyes drifted to a framed photo on the shelf, her swearing-in day. Hand on the Bible. Eyes forward. "White suit, then two. They always want us to move on," she said at last. They never ask them to go back and fix it. Cable news had turned the hearing clip into a week-long saga. But now the debate had shifted, not about racism or gatekeeping or even power. No, they'd brought it down to decorum. She was too sharp. She interrupted. She made it personal. As if being told you don't belong wasn't personal. The hypocrisy stung. But it didn't surprise her. Then came the email. Formal summons. Jasmine Crockett was invited to testify before a special ethics panel regarding alleged breaches of decorum and institutional norms during committee proceedings. Lena read it over her shoulder, brow furrowing. "This could be a trap," she said. "They'll spin it, say you're grandstanding." Jasmine exhaled slowly, standing tall. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe they just handed me a microphone." With the whole country listening, the fluorescent lights in the private pre-hearing room buzzed with the same sterile hum Jasmine had come to associate with bureaucracy, the sound of power pretending to be neutral. She sat across from a middle-aged ethics counsel in a tailored gray suit, every inch of his posture designed to suggest impartiality. His voice, though measured, carried the weight of institutional warning. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, folding his hands on the table, "you should know your testimony could shift precedent. If you go on record, we enter uncharted procedural ground. There will be consequences." Jasmine said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that he continued. "We've reviewed the footage. We're aware of the context. But the Ethics Committee's mandate is not public opinion. It's institutional integrity. We'd urge caution in politicizing your identity within your statement." She raised an eyebrow. "Politicizing my identity?" He offered a diplomatic shrug. "It's about tone, optics, the way language is received across the aisle." There it was, the old song, in a new key. They wanted her truth, wrapped in apology. Her presence, muted by protocol. Her pain, edited for bipartisan comfort. Jasmine thanked him quietly and walked out. Pulse simmering. In the hallway, Lena was waiting with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one over and began to speak, but Jasmine held up a hand. "Not now," she said softly. She needed space to think. And not just as a politician, she thought of the Tuskegee hearings, studied in law school. How the families of men experimented on without consent were made to dress in Sunday best and speak with composed rage. How they were asked to convince a system that had already failed them to take their humanity seriously and apologize. If they raised their voice in the process, she considered walking away from the hearing, refusing to give it the dignity of her words, but then a young staffer she didn't recognize approached. Eyes wide, voice hushed. "This was slipped under my office door," the staffer said. "It has your name on it." The envelope was unmarked, sealed with cheap tape. Inside were printed screenshots, internal communications from Gaetz's team, a script, a cue card labeled Crockett response, line-by-line instructions, timing notes, emphasis in bold, "You don't belong here." It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a stunt, a performance, a premeditated insult aimed not just at her, but at everyone who looked like her, thought like her, fought like her. She stared at the paper for a long moment. There would be no silence. Not now, not when the script had been found. The hearing room was colder than she remembered, not in temperature, but in tone. Jasmine sat alone at the long table reserved for testifying members, a nameplate in front of her, the seal of the United States Congress carved into the polished wood beneath her fingers. Cameras were positioned at every angle. Behind the elevated dais sat the Ethics Committee, 5 members, bipartisan in theory, skeptical in practice. Each stared at her with unreadable eyes, masks forged from decades of political survival. This wasn't about rules. This was about power, about precedent, about whether the chamber would punish not the insult, but the response. The chair, Senator Galvin, cleared his throat. "We are convened today," he began, "to evaluate whether the conduct during last week's Oversight Committee hearing met the standards of congressional decorum and professional restraint." He glanced at Jasmine. "You may begin." She took a breath, slow, measured, but not to steady herself. She was already steady. It was the room that felt like it was spinning. "Mr. Chair," she said, "members of this committee." She looked up, eyes locking with each member in turn. "I was told I don't belong here. And now I'm told that how I responded may have breached decorum. But what is decorum if it protects comfort over truth?" Galvin shifted in his seat. Jasmine reached into her folder and slid out the printed email. This insult was not spontaneous. It was scripted, timed, practiced. The phrase, "You don't belong here," was literally bolded. Gasps flickered through the chamber. Phones buzzed. The live feed picked up steam. Jasmine kept going. "I represent constituents who've been told to be quiet, to wait, to smile through humiliation. And every time we rise, we are asked to do so gently or not at all." She let the silence hang for a beat. "I will not apologize for clarity. I will not apologize for presence. And I will not apologize for breaking a decorum that never once protected me." Galvin leaned forward, lips parted to interject, but thought better of it. He sat back. Across the room, a junior Republican member whispered something to a colleague, nervous, calculating. The narrative had shifted. Jasmine Crockett wasn't a disruptor. She was a witness. And now, the question wasn't should she have responded. It was how had no one responded before? The long table had once been a place to sit in judgment. Now, it had become a stage, and Jasmine had turned it into a reckoning. The next morning, the headlines roared louder than they had in weeks. "Congresswoman Crockett unleashes truth at ethics." Panel, scripted insults? Gaetz facing backlash over pre-planned attack? The story had shifted violently, from decorum to deception, but inside the Capitol, the walls didn't echo the outside world. Inside, power recalibrated, and Matt Gaetz wasn't finished. By noon, Gaetz had secured a last-minute appearance before the same ethics panel. His team leaked the move to the press as a gesture of good faith, but it was anything but. Jasmine stood outside the chamber doors when she saw the wave of cameras approaching. Gaetz emerged from a black SUV, sunglasses still on indoors. A faint smirk curling beneath his well-practiced jaw. Their eyes met. It wasn't rage he radiated. It was calculation. Inside, he launched into a speech laced with veiled righteousness and strategic distortions. This body has always welcomed dissent, he began, but when dissent becomes division, when identity is used as a shield for aggression, we must ask, who benefits? He turned to the committee, his tone syrupy. I regret that my words have been misunderstood, but I will not accept that disagreement is bigotry. Jasmine, seated in the gallery, felt the words like static electricity, soft enough to fly under censure, sharp enough to cut. The room fell quiet. Then, a voice interrupted. It was Representative Wills, a quiet independent from Oregon, rarely known to speak. He leaned into the mic. Mr. Gaetz, he said, did you or did you not prepare language targeting Congresswoman Crockett prior to the hearing? Gaetz blinked. My team prepares talking points for all hearings. That wasn't the question. A pause. Tension thickened. Gaetz shrugged, evasive. I won't apologize for preparing to debate ideas. Wills stared at him. You didn't debate an idea, you debated her existence. Gasps rippled across the room. The chair banged the gavel once, not for discipline, but to reclaim control. Cameras zoomed in on Jasmine. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She just watched. Let the country decide who looked small in that moment. As the session adjourned. Staffers scrambled, reporters shouted, and the public tuned in like it was the Super Bowl. This wasn't just a procedural skirmish anymore. It was a battle over who gets to define America's future and who gets to speak in its name. It began with a single ping, then another. By the third buzz of her phone, Jasmine knew something had shifted again. Lena burst into the office, breathless, holding her tablet like it was radioactive. It's out, she said. The full Gaetz memo, every draft, every directive, someone leaked it. Jasmine took the tablet. There, in black and white, were internal emails, voice memo transcripts, rehearsal outlines, not just for Gaetz's insult, but for a full-blown media strategy. The attack had been planned weeks in advance, focus tested, cleared by donors. There were even suggested Twitter captions. One note read, "Push her, make her emotional. If she breaks decorum, we win." Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the cold precision of it all. It was never personal for them, just tactical. She was a variable in a war room. A symbol to be provoked, not a human to be respected. Within hours, the memo swept through the internet like wildfire. News outlets scrambled to verify, but it was too late. Screenshots dominated every timeline. Hashtag scripted Gaetz trended across political divides. Even Republican strategists began to distance themselves. That night, Jasmine returned home and stood in the quiet of her kitchen, staring out the window into the D.C. dark. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a voicemail from an unknown number. She hit play. It was the voice of a young staffer from across the aisle, nervous, unsteady. I'm sorry. For what they did, I was in the room. I helped write it. I didn't think it would go that far. I didn't think you'd answer the way you did. They wanted a moment. You gave them a mirror. Jasmine sat at the edge of her dining table, letting the message echo into silence. They had wanted her to crack. Instead, she crystallized. The following morning, her team drafted a formal request, a motion to open an official House investigation into the weaponization of identity-based rhetoric. For political theater. She didn't just want a rebuke, she wanted reform. And for the first time in weeks, the winds in Washington shifted, not with scandal, but with the threat of actual accountability. The chamber was packed, not with the usual scatter of half-listening representatives, but with full rows of tense bodies, sharpened stares, and flickering camera lights. Word had spread quickly. Jasmine Crockett was filing a formal motion that could send shockwaves through the very machinery of congressional protocol. She stood at the center of the floor, not behind a podium, not propped up by handlers, but grounded. Feet planted, voice calm, eyes unwavering. I rise today, she began, not in anger, but in responsibility. The room hushed. In recent days, We've watched the weaponization of identity not just as a means of marginalization, but as a political tactic. We've witnessed a coordinated effort to provoke, to undermine, and to capitalize on the silencing of dissent. Murmurs moved through the gallery above. Even CSPAN's normally static coverage seemed to hold its breath. Jasmine held up the now infamous leaked memo, its pages marked with yellow highlights, timestamped directives, and embedded strategies. This document, she said, is not merely evidence of misconduct. It is evidence of design. Of a system that rewards humiliation more than it values truth. Of a culture that prioritizes theatrics over public service. Gaetz sat 2 rows behind her, arms crossed, gaze unreadable. She didn't look back. My motion, she continued, is to establish an investigatory committee tasked with reviewing the systemic use of race, gender, and identity as political weapons on this floor. Not just from one party, from both, because the rot is not partisan, it is institutional. Gasps. Whispers. One member of her own party stared down at his notes, ashamed. I know this motion may fail, Jasmine said plainly. I know the system resists its own reflection. But this record, this speech, this moment will exist whether or not the motion passes, and that is power. She looked out across the chamber, not for validation, but for memory. As if to remind every woman, every young staffer, every marginalized voice who might one day stand in her shoes, you are not alone. The speaker acknowledged the motion. Debate would follow, votes would come, and the knives, sharpened in back rooms and whisper campaigns, would come with them. But Jasmine had done what no script could anticipate. She'd rewritten the scene, not a spectacle, a stand, not a reaction, a reckoning, and win or lose. Her words, raw, unfiltered, undeniable, were now part of the congressional record. Forever. The cameras had stopped rolling. But the real war was just beginning. Behind the sealed wood and frosted glass of Capitol conference rooms, strategy, meetings churned late into the night. Senior aides whispered, party whips tallied votes, and leadership on both sides of the aisle grew increasingly restless. Jasmine's motion, once dismissed as symbolic, had stirred something deeper, not just outrage, not just defense, fear. Not of her, but of exposure. Inside one such room, a Democratic centrist shook his head. She's going to make it. Impossible to toe the line. This isn't the kind of fight we win, another replied. She already won. We're just waiting to see how deep the wound goes. Across the aisle, Gaetz convened his own emergency meeting. His allies, usually loyal, now questioned the wisdom of turning Jasmine into a national martyr. You turned her into a lightning rod, hissed one conservative strategist. What was the plan? Poke the fire and hope it didn't spread? Gaetz leaned forward, tired of playing defense. She wants to make this about race and gender. Let her. This is a culture war, and we fight those better. But it wasn't working, because Jasmine wasn't fighting a culture war, she was fighting for truth. Meanwhile, inside her modest office, Jasmine reviewed anonymous letters, emails, and voicemails from interns, ex-staffers, even former elected officials, all sharing stories of marginalization, silencing, and scripted takedowns. The memo had struck a nerve. But her motion had hit an artery. Lena entered the room with a new update. A Republican House member, a moderate, had quietly signaled they might cross the aisle in support of the investigation. They're scared, Lena said softly. But some of them are human enough to be moved. Jasmine stared out her window at the Capitol dome glowing in the night, like a lighthouse built atop contradiction. They're not afraid of me, she said. They're afraid of what I represent if I'm right. And then came the twist. A whistleblower, internal to Gaetz's communications team, reached out through an encrypted channel. They had more. Audio files. Planning sessions. Jokes made at Jasmine's expense, followed by rehearsed lines to spin outrage into campaign dollars. Proof of everything. The smoke was becoming fire. And for the first time, the system began to sweat, because the backrooms, the ones where power is shaped in whispers and wine, were no longer safe. They were being lit from within. The flash drive arrived wrapped in a plain manila envelope, slid beneath Jasmine's office door like a secret too dangerous for daylight. No return address. Just a post-it written in neat block letters. If you're going to burn it down, light every match. Inside were hours of recordings. Lena locked the door and closed the blinds as Jasmine inserted the drive into her laptop. The screen flickered to life and then laughter, male voices. Gaetz's voice. So what's the line again? Hit her with, "You don't belong here, let it hang." The silence will do half the work. That'll get the bass foaming. It's performance. She's a mark. Jasmine sat frozen, eyes fixed on the playback bar, creeping forward like a fuse. Her hands curled into fists on the armrest. Not from rage, not anymore. From clarity. This wasn't politics. This was cruelty and choreography. There were recordings of strategy calls, donor briefings where Jasmine's name was floated like bait, references to her skin tone, her voice, the optics of making her. Snap on camera. At one point, Gaetz was heard laughing. She won't walk out. She's too new, too proud. That's her Achilles heel, her belief in the system. Lena's voice cracked as she whispered, "This isn't just unethical, this is psychological warfare." By morning, Jasmine had compiled the files, annotated transcripts, and appended context into a sealed binder labeled Exhibit C. It would be submitted to the ethics committee that afternoon, but first, she did something unexpected. She released it. All of it. In a 3-minute video posted to her social media. Jasmine sat alone before the camera. No podium, no teleprompter, no congressional seal. Just her voice. "They didn't just insult me," she said. "They rehearsed it, they recorded it, they raised money off it, and they assumed I would fold, that I would crumble under the weight of their mockery. But I won't, because this isn't about me. It's about every person who's been told they don't belong, simply because their presence makes power uncomfortable." The video ended. No music. No editing. Just truth. By nightfall, it had 22 million views. Cable networks. Cut from panel debates to live coverage of congressional reactions. Protesters gathered outside the Capitol steps. The ethics panel announced an emergency hearing. Gaetz, once the hunter, now stood cornered in his own spotlight. And Jasmine? She didn't wait for justice. She delivered the evidence and handed the system a mirror.